On July 2nd of 1863, Robert E. Lee and the Confederates threw almost everything they had at the Union. But George Meade was able to reinforce his line and was able to hold off and just barely gain victory on day two. James Longstreet said it was the best 3 hours done by any troops on any battlefield, and it was a heck of a fight. But the Union held the field, and it sets up day three at the Battle of Gettysburg, the high water mark of the Confederacy. Pickett's charge, a day that really will live in infamy when it comes to Confederate lore. But the Confederates are trying to win this war in one final swoop here, and it just doesn't happen. Lee thinks his men could do nearly anything, but they couldn't do this. Now, our goal here is to identify the cause that led to the South's failure and the North's success in the Battle of Gettysburg. This one's going to focus more on the South's failure rather than the North's success. Let's get into it here. Day three at Gettysburg. Lee, of course, doesn't have Stonewall Jackson anymore. He died 2 months before this. And so, James Longstreet's going to be the guy in charge of the main assault here. They call this Longstreet's assault, but you also know this as Pickett's charge. That's the name that gets thrown out around the most because one of the biggest groups that's going to be partaking in this are some fresh Virginia troops under George Pickett. You also had Johnson Pettigrew's troops and Isaac Trimble's troops, but the person that's really going to be leading it all together is going to be James Longstreet. He's going to be in charge of it. He's the person that Lee now most trusts as far as his generals, as far as his corps commanders. And so he can't think of anybody else who he wants to have lead this charge. It's Longstreet. But Longstreet does not like it. And he maybe didn't even like the second day's advance, but he still went on that. The South is going to question Longstreet and whether he truly had the heart for this and whether he really cared here, because he was protesting up until the time when it was finally agreed upon by Robert E. Lee, or decided upon by Robert E. Lee. Longstreet did not want to do it. He instead wanted to go fight in Maryland. He instead wanted to pull away from Gettysburg and go fight in some place that is of the Confederates' choosing, where they could have the high ground and have the Union have to bash away at them. So Longstreet protested and protested and protested, but to no avail. Robert E. Lee was fighting it out here, and he was going to attack the center of the Union line. He thought, we tried the flanks yesterday. They were strong. It's time to try the center. There must be a weak point someplace. Longstreet, I need you to attack the center. Again, Pickett's charge is named after George Pickett. He happened to have some of the freshest troops here in the battlefield. They had not taken part in the Battle of Gettysburg whatsoever. And so his group is going to be one of the biggest ones involved here, but they're not the only ones. But George Pickett is one of the leaders that is going to be going out there with his men upon this field, trying to take the Union center. Now, for the Confederacy, they have 12,000 men. Some people say as many 15,000 men going across the field here. But as you can see in this picture, it is wide open field. And it is a ridiculous charge because of that. But all of these 12,000 men are going to be heading towards this clump of trees or this copse of trees. So Robert E. Lee gave them a point to aim everybody at. And it's going to be that area right there. But they're going to be crossing over this open field. I visited Gettysburg last week, and I want you to take a look at some of the videos as we go forward here to give some more detail to this overall talk about day three at Gettysburg. And I also have some video there of the area of the copse of trees and the area that the Virginians had to cross in order to go attack the Union center. The day began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon as the Confederates got all 160 cannon in place, and they started trying to blast away at the Union defenses at the center of the line. They wanted to make sure that the Union line was wrecked somewhat before they sent the foot soldiers in there, before they sent Longstreet's infantry in there. Sadly for the Confederacy, most of their cannonballs actually overshot entirely. And you totally understand why. With all those 160 cannon just blasting away, you couldn't see a thing. There's just fog, there's smoke everywhere. So they had no idea if their cannonballs were actually hitting their intended targets. It turns out they weren't. They were entirely overshooting. They almost actually hit George Meade's headquarters, which was behind their front lines by far. And so the Confederate cannon were really not doing their job, but they blasted away for the next 2 hours with the biggest bombardment ever seen in an American battle, or at least in the American Civil War. Now, wonderful clip that I want you to see here. It especially goes into what these foot soldiers had to face when they finally moved across the field. But at 4 o'clock, the Confederate infantry of 12,000 men started to move across the field. But many of them didn't even get anywhere close to the Union defenses because on the way, they faced, first off, hollow cannonballs that would explode in the air, spreading shrapnel all over their men. And then eventually, once they got close, they faced solid shot. So basically, like these 12 to 16-pound bowling balls that could just blast your leg off in just one impact. And they also then faced canister shot with all those 36 or 48 metal balls shooting out at speeds higher than 700 miles an hour that are just ripping people to pieces and destroying entire regiments at a time, or at least, sorry, not regiment, entire companies at a time as they're trying to cross over the field. This was an absolute suicide mission. They're facing all this stuff as they're crossing over this open field. They have no defenses. They have no trenches. They have no cover whatsoever. There's no element of surprise. They're just going straight into the Union defenses. It is a poorly devised attack by Robert E. Lee, but it truly seems like Lee thinks that his men can do anything. I have one more battlefield talk that I've created there at Gettysburg for you that's located around the area where the Union defenders were at. And so I'd like you to take a look at that piece as well. In the end, after a couple hours of fighting, the Union line holds strong. To be honest, the cannon did a whole lot of the fighting for them. The Union riflemen, the infantry, they were behind this rock line right here. And guides at Gettysburg say there may have been less than 100 Confederates that actually got past the Union rock line. And so got straight to the center of the Union line. The Confederates just got blasted along the way, and they did not stand much of a chance. One great story that comes out of this is of two great friends from back in their California days and back in their experiences when they were both part of the United States Army, Lewis Armistead and Winfield Scott Hancock. Lewis Armistead was a Virginian. He decided to turn Confederate once the war broke out. But with his best friend and his roommate, he told him before he left California, he said to Lewis Armistead said to Winfield Scott Hancock, "If I ever face you on a battlefield, may God strike me dead." Well, Lewis Armistead had to face his buddy on this battlefield, and he had to cross that rock line. And Lewis Armistead did just that. He actually got past the rock line, and he's facing his great friend's corps. In the midst of that, he ends up getting shot. When he's down on the field, he actually asks some of the Union men, "You know Winfield Scott Hancock?" And they said, "Yes, the general's been taken off the field. He's been hit." And Lewis Armistead says, "Not both of us. Not all of us." Well, Lewis Armistead dies on that field. Winfield Scott Hancock would recover and would last for the rest of the Civil War, would survive the Civil War. But Lewis Armistead, again, died on the field. So that statement that he made, saying, "If I ever face you on a battlefield, may God strike me dead," ended up coming completely true. But you had these great, great friends from before the Civil War that ended up facing off here at the highest point here within the Civil War, highest point within Gettysburg. Now, people would ask, why did such a mastermind of Robert E. Lee, why would he decide to launch Pickett's charge? Why would he decide to do such a stupid thing? Well, there's a big kind of theory out there that might have some legs to it. And that is that in the spring of 1863, the spring of that same year, Robert E. Lee was having some serious chest pain. There's a possibility they might have had a minor heart attack. And he seems like he might be worried that on any given day in the future, he might have that massive heart attack that's going to put him out of this world forever. And so he desperately thinks that this is the battle, this is the win, this is where I can win the Civil War. If I try to fight this for much longer, I'm going to end up being dead. I'm going to have a heart attack and it's going to be over. And the Confederacy is not going to be able to recover after they lose me. And so this is it for him. He thinks, and he's not going to quit or anything after this, but it's like he feels like this must be the final battle. I must do everything possible and take every single chance possible to try to win right here, right now, because otherwise I might die tomorrow. Now, as Independence Day dawned of July 4th, 1863, Robert E. Lee had lost so many men, he had lost their morale entirely after Pickett's charge, and he realized he cannot stay here any longer. And so he's going to send his troops back down to Virginia, and the Union had won the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, Abraham Lincoln, not necessarily as ecstatic as you think he'd be. He actually starts getting gets messages into George Meade, his commander, to try to say, chase Robert E. Lee. Go after him. Like, please chase after him and go put this war to an end. George Meade's not going to do it. He has no attack plan in mind. And Lincoln is so furious because he feels like he just dealt with the same thing by way of George McClellan. And now he's facing this by George Meade. He actually thinks that George Meade might be out to get him and out to ruin his political chances in his life, basically. George Meade wasn't. He just wasn't a very aggressive general. And he did not necessarily know if Lee could catch him somewhere and reverse the tide entirely and beat him. And so Meade was not going to attack, and Lincoln was none too happy. The Battle of Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle ever on U.S. soil, with 53,000 casualties. After this, the Confederacy is still going to fight on, and the war is going to last almost 2 more years. But the Confederacy will never recover and be as strong as they had before this battle. They will never be able to mount a very serious attack in the North ever again. They'll enter Northern soil, but they'll never have the chance that they had right here, right now. Now, 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln came to dedicate a portion of ground as a battlefield to the fallen at Gettysburg. He wasn't even supposed to be the biggest speaker there for the dedication of that cemetery to the soldiers. He created a 2-minute speech, but that 2-minute speech ended up being legendary. And it basically rechristened this war and gave a new cause to the Union, as they were now going to dedicate the rest of the war to those fallen soldiers on that field of Gettysburg, and they could now have a new birth of freedom for the United States of America. So his Gettysburg Address became a tremendous rally cry for his soldiers as they fought the rest of the war. Last thing here, James Longstreet, once again, because he had the guts to question Lee, he's going to end up being questioned by the Confederacy, and they're going to blame him for this loss. They're not going to blame Lee for it. They're going to blame Longstreet because somehow he was not faithful enough to Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy because he dared to question Lee. Yeah, maybe he delayed a little bit, but he did his best. Until Lee's dying day, he was going to back Longstreet and call him his old war horse and say that Longstreet was completely loyal. So Lee completely believed in Longstreet until Lee passed away 5 years after the war, and he never said a bad word about him. The sad thing for Longstreet is that he did not get memorialized in any kind of good way, whereas Stonewall Jackson and Lee are just like immortal beings. Longstreet didn't even get a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield until 100 years basically after everybody else did. And this is his monument, but it's stuck behind the trees on Seminary Ridge, and most people don't even come to visit it. Longstreet gets blamed for losing Gettysburg. Lee doesn't. To finish our study of Gettysburg, make sure to play the quizzes game. It's going to take us through the 3 days at Gettysburg. All right, thank you. I'll see you tomorrow.